Thank
What
you
can we do for you today?
so much. I'm going to go ahead and jump in to share my screen just so we can get that going right away. See if we can get this full screen. Are we seeing that full screen?
Yes, you're good.
Looks good. Thank you. All right. Well, this is my last visit with you this semester. And if you've visited with me for any of my other sessions or if you've watched them recorded, what we've done is kind of two things we were trying to accomplish. The first is to look at a variety of places where you're going to find primary sources if you're looking at them for your students' learning. And the second is to look at a few different approaches for students actually utilizing primary sources. And that's going to wrap up today with our look at DPLA, Digital Public Library of America, and as well as a brief discussion about looking at other local sources. And I wanted to put these two together, and hopefully you'll see why as we get through our slides today. So we're going to kind of dive into three areas. The first of which we'll spend just a little bit of time on, which is why might you use DPLA? The second is what are entry points into DPLA resources to share with students? And this is where we'll also spend a little time talking about local resources as well. And then lastly, we'll take a look at how can you support students in interacting with DPL resources? What kind of things are already kind of baked in to DPLA to help you do that? And of course, at any time, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to chime in with those. I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat, although sometimes with things kind of the screen that I'm looking at, sometimes that is a little challenging to view, but I'll keep an eye on, try to keep an eye on that as well. So let's jump in and talk about why people might use, and students of all ages might use DPLA. And I think probably when we talk about primary sources in general, and we talk about DPLA more specifically, if students are taking on the role of historians, that might be a reason for them to utilize images or text or other primary source documents from DPLA. Now, I know you might think, well, you know, my students are young, they're not historians necessarily. Let me just tell you that we just used this terminology, or I just used this terminology just about an hour ago with my second grade, or not my second grade, excuse me, my second kindergarten class of the week, where last week we had read a book called The Day the River Caught Fire. It's a newer book by Barry Wittenstein, and it gives an account of a river, and now I'm blanking on the name, although I should know it because I've read the book several times, catching fire, and then that leading to a movement that around an environmental movement that ultimately leads to the first Earth Day, which is going to be coming up in just a few days as far as the anniversary of Earth Day and this year's Earth Day celebrations. So we read that book, and then what we did this week was we actually looked at an image that was connected to that river catching fire. Students used a primary source analysis approach that we talked about in an earlier session, where they were asked to talk about what they see in that picture that might connect to the story that they read that helps them understand what is actually happening in the picture. They were asked what they think is actually happening, and maybe if they were able to go ahead and connect it to a moment within the story. And then they were asked, what kind of other questions does this bring up? What kind of things are they wondering about after looking at this picture? So that See, Think, Wonder that was talked about at an earlier session that I spoke with you all about. But really what they were doing is taking on that role of historian. They were looking at a historical document in a really specific way, as opposed to how we might look at a photograph in comparison where we might just look at that photograph, make a few observations, maybe not verbalize any of that, and then move on. Instead, we had a very inquiry-based approach that was based in how historians might look at those particular pieces. And that was kindergarten. So even as young as kindergarten, they can be taking on that role of historian, and that language of looking at a photo like a historian would look at a photo was something that we utilized in that discussion. Another reason you might tap into DPLA is if students are researching or acting as researchers. Now, again, this might be through a historical context, but if what they're trying to do is answer their own questions or answer research-based questions, that might be done through the use of primary sources and through the use of DPLA. For me, typically, this is with older elementary students, typically grades 3, 4, 5, and up, where that kind of approach is happening, but it's part of a larger research element as opposed to a smaller primary source inquiry, which might happen more from that historian's approach. We also take an inquiry-based approach to analyzing those primary sources so that we can pull the information out of it for our research. So that same inquiry approach or a similar inquiry approach that we talked about in some of our earlier sessions may apply as well. And then lastly, and this kind of crosses over with our historian piece with my story about my class that just happened earlier this afternoon, this might also be a place where students go if they are a reader, because especially if students are reading historical fiction or historical nonfiction, there may be opportunities to connect what they're reading to the primary sources themselves. And so that idea of how we look at the photo in my example from earlier is certainly from a historian's model, but what we actually do with that, what we do with the information we gather from the photo is tapping into that primary source, that DPLA primary source as a reader, and then connecting with that as a reader. What is that? How does that connect with the text that we interacted with? Or in this case, the text and the illustrations that we interacted with? Where are the connections there? And how can we think about the reader, the authors and illustrators and the work that they do, and through the primary sources that are connected with the books that we read. So 3 different reasons why you might tap in to DPLA resources: historians, researchers, and readers. And again, those can be at a variety of grade levels. So DPLA is kind of unique compared to some of the other resources that I've shared with you. And that is because DPLA is not necessarily the holder of these resources. Instead, what they're doing is they are gathering resources from institutions across the United States. I was looking back at an earlier presentation that I had connected with DPLA, and I had a screenshot that was similar to this with the search bar. That was from approximately 6 years ago. And at that time, if my memory serves from looking at this within the last week, there were about 17 million images, text, videos, and sounds from across the United States. Now, DPLA has that listed as over 47 million. So this idea that in the past 6 years, DPLA has added access to an additional 30 million images, text, videos, and sounds is, I think, a pretty impressive sign of their growth. We'll talk a little bit more about how those connections are made and how those institutions offer those resources to DPLA. But as you might expect, or at least as I expect, because we've seen this through a variety of our other institutions that we've looked at, when we do searches on DPLA, you can narrow those results. So you can look at usage, you can look at type, meaning format, you can look at subject, date, location, language, which typically isn't helpful because most of these are either don't have a language component if they're entirely visual, or mostly English, but there could be specific instances where that might be helpful. The collection, the contributing institution, the partner institution, and we'll go over what those last couple mean a little bit later. But there's a lot of different ways when you start to do searches around these 47 million items that you can start to narrow those down. And of course, as any good searcher knows, and I know that all of you are likely very adept at doing these types of searches or searching in general at this point, the better your search terms, the more likely that you're going to find what you need right off the bat. But also being able to narrow it down in a variety of ways can be helpful. So for example, in what I shared with you earlier, looking for a primary source for my kindergartners, I'm entirely going to be looking for visual images. So narrowing down under format is going to be really important to me. When I'm looking for a primary source that's tied to a specific topic of study, but also to a specific date, narrowing down by date, again, is going to be very important to me. And then to a lesser degree, possibly looking at collections or contributing institutions or partner institutions might be important as well. And that might be to actually broaden my search out. And again, I'll share a little bit more about that later. So there's a few other ways that you can browse what DPLA has to offer. And I'll mention it at this point. And I know I feel like I've mentioned it at earlier presentations, times when I've been able to share with you. At any point in this, if you decide to go off to DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America, whose website is very simply dp.la, and start to browse and start to search and do a little investigating of your own as I do my own sharing with you, you are not going to hurt my feelings. You can even turn my volume down. If this time together is going to get you doing some initial exploration, give you an opportunity to start doing a little searching, to think about how you might want to use or what you might be able to use from DPLA, or browsing to just get a general overview, because we're not going to look at everything that DPLA has to offer in our hour, but you might be able to quickly do some scrolling and searching. You are welcome to do that. We're going to do a little bit of looking under these three areas where you can do some exploration, and that is to browse by topic, to browse by partner, and to look at exhibitions. So I don't think I actually have them in this order. Yeah, so let's take a look first at exhibits. These are just a few of the exhibits and some of these obviously might not be applicable to what you're looking for, but some of them might. DPLA has over 24 exhibits, and the intention is to tell stories of national significance, as you can see at the bottom there, using source material from libraries, archives, and museums across the United States. So one of the nice things about some of these, is that even though you have multiple institutions that are contributing to DPLA, when you're looking at the exhibits, for example, it's curating a collection from across multiple institutions. I think one really important thing to share as well is that this is not an exhaustive search. You're not getting everything, for example, that's connected to the race to the moon or the evolution of the personal camera, but you are getting some of the kind of highlights, some of the best, according to the individuals that are putting together these exhibits. So once you find one of these that might be of interest to you, and actually I think my examples are around another exhibit that has to do with women and early flight. There it is, American Aviatrixes, Women with Wings. What you're going to see is something very similar to this, where you have an introduction, and I apologize, I decided not to cross over my category or my arrows there. But if you look on the right side of the screen, what you see there is the introduction. So you get the introduction to this particular exhibit. Thinking around, think like an in-person exhibit as at a museum, for example. You might see some kind of introductory material, or you might have a pamphlet that would have introductory material that would be kind of this overview of placing myself in that particular space. And then you can see to the left side of the screen, you have these categories. And as you see here as well, hopefully, where I have the development of aviation, it breaks out into an introduction, and then the golden age of aviation, and then World War II era aircrafts. And then you have these other kind of larger categories and then subcategories that break out as well. In each of these, you're going to have typically more than one, two, three, four is not unusual. Primary source documents that are connected with this particular exhibit. Sometimes, if we're looking at things like images, you'll be able to zoom in to some degree on those. You'll be able to see, if you would scroll down just below, and I wasn't able to capture it with my screenshot, but you'll actually get the title of that particular image as well, all kind of packaged together. I've mentioned this in earlier presentations, but having this all together can be useful in a lot of different ways. Number one, if you're not particularly savvy with a particular time period or topic, this could be a really good way to kind of get yourself up to speed. I know, for example, that we are getting in our district new curriculum shifts, kindergarten through 5th grade, and especially with our upper elementary teachers, they're actually shifting the time period that they're studying. And so if we have teachers, which we do in many cases, who are used to teaching a certain curriculum, a certain time period in history around their social studies curriculum, that shift is causing them a little bit of anxiety, because not that they don't know how to teach social studies, but they've essentially said, I'm not really an expert on that period of time or the events during that particular period. Something like this, if you have a period that matches up with curriculum that you are going to be teaching, or if you're getting new curriculum, if it's just something that hasn't necessarily felt, you haven't felt secure in it entirely before, if you felt like you can dig a little bit deeper, if you have a teacher, for example, that's new to the district and that curriculum is a little bit new to that, to them, then this could be a really valuable tool. The other time where this could be valuable is with our upper elementary students, our students who are readers. Having some of that secondary source text might at times really benefit how they're able to view and understand the primary source. So even though we might be interacting with the primary source individually, we might then go back to the secondary source text to give this great context to the primary source. If we've got emerging readers or readers who don't deal well with larger blocks of text, we might only take part of this and share this with them, or we might invite them just to read a certain paragraph of this, or we might read it aloud to them. We could do that in a lot, differentiate and support that in a lot of different ways. But again, that secondary source text could be really valuable in interacting with the primary sources that are connected with it. Once you start to dig into this, you'll see kind of other examples here of what you're going to see. So in this case, we're in that same exhibit, but we've dug a little bit deeper on the channel, on the columns on the left, and we've dug into first aviatrixes, in this case to Ruth Bancroft Law, and then we can click on and view additional information. Now, I will share that some of these exhibits have been up for a while. As I mentioned, DPLA 6 years ago had 17 million items. These exhibits have been being made for a long time. I have run across a couple of exhibits where you can get to this point, but if you notice at the bottom where it reads view item information, I run into a few where the link is then broken. It doesn't lead you to what you're looking to find. The good news is that, at least from my perspective, is that you can see the title of that particular piece of work, and you can see the contributing institution. So you can go to that contributing institution and search there if you want, or you can just search the title of that with quotation marks, typically in Google, and you'll be able to get to that particular, that item that you're looking for. So even though some of these links some of them need a little bit of updating, I think that's because of the items that particular institutions are sharing have shifted. I don't think that that's anything that DPLA has done wrong. They just have to go through their exhibits and either swap out with different pieces or link in some different ways potentially. But if you notice that, that's not kind of a reason not to dig a little bit deeper. So if you click on view item information, what you're going to get is that smaller thumbprint to the right. I didn't give you the full bibliographic data for that. If you would scroll, if you'd be able to see that screen, you'd be able to scroll down and see all kinds of additional information, some things that might be important to you. For example, when that photograph was taken, where it was taken, those types of items. It might even have information around like the size of the photograph and those types of things that probably are not as important to you, but it has some information that if you wanted, or a student wanted to dig a little bit deeper, it might be helpful to have some of that bibliographic information. But you also notice that you have the link to view full item. And when you click that, you actually leave DPLA. I mentioned earlier that DPLA, I always view DPLA kind of like this umbrella. And then under that umbrella are all these other institutions that are providing their resources. And the way that I think about it as well is that we've got museums and libraries and archives across the entire United States. And many of them have spent a lot of effort and money and resources to digitize parts of their collection. And they have probably a fairly regional audience, typically with that. For example, we have the Missouri History Museum, which is right down the street from my school. They've digitized, part of their collection. But who would know about that? Who would know to even think of accessing that? I don't even know if you would go across the state to Kansas City, or even if you would go to cross the river to parts of Southern Illinois compared to where I am, that people, educators, students, for example, would know to look for the Missouri History Museum as a provider of historical digitized items. But if you know about DPLA, you are not able to just search for items from the Missouri History Museum, but you're able to search for, as you saw, millions and millions of items that have been provided by hundreds and hundreds of institutions. So the idea is to increase traffic to all of those smaller institutions and to provide those resources a little more easily to our to not only just people across the country, but in my view, especially to educators and to students. Because again, I wouldn't know exactly all of the places I could look, but DPLA helps me start to target in on some locations and then show me directly through their site what I'm going to see. Now, if you click on that view full item, this is going to bring us to where this item is actually housed digitally, and that is the portal to Texas history, as you can see right here. Now, you get, as you see, a little bit more information of the description on the right, the description, the physical description, the creation information, the context. Now, most of this, maybe not all, but most of this is housed under DPLA's portion of the website. That metadata has all been shared over to DPLA. But one of the things I wanted to specifically point out, and again, I didn't get it fully in the screenshot, and I apologize for that. It wasn't quite fitting. But if you scroll down a little bit, you see under the slightly larger image of Ruth Bancroft Law, you see two thumbnails. One of them is that same image of her in this plane. The other thing you see is actually, if you click on it, you actually see the back of this photo, and there's writing on the back of this photo. So that again is going to be able to give you even more information potentially. Now that doesn't happen all the time, but clicking through to view the full item is often a good idea to just get a fuller picture. DPLA is that portal, but then it brings you to these other institutions which might have even more information. The other reason I often go to the original portal that is housing that primary source is because that is often where I'm going to get the best luck of being able to download the highest resolution image, and whether it's text or image-based, whatever it is, the highest resolution piece for me to be able to maybe print that out for my students or show it on a full screen, whatever the case may be. I'm going to get that best result typically through the original, the place where that primary source is housed. Okay, so that was a little bit of looking at exhibits. I want to take a look here at browsing by topic, and so you can see what that looks like. I want you to think of topics as kind of these very broad strokes that highlight areas of the collection They can spur further thinking and give you ideas for additional searches. So again, we're not putting everything that DPLA has to offer. We're giving kind of this sampling. So you can see here that we've got really broad strokes. The American Civil War, that's a huge topic. Aviation, again, a huge topic. Baseball, civil rights movement, food, immigration. We get a little more narrow, 1840s, but again, still we've got a long decade here. Photography, my goodness, that's monstrous. Women in science, again, we don't often get enough information about that to our students, in my opinion, and I'm speaking only for me and my school, but again, it can be a really broad topic across a variety. Of course, science, broad, lots of different categories there. Women across decades and decades and decades, we've got lots of different options of where we can go with this. So we get one big broad, or several big broad strokes here. I'm going to dig into food. I happened, when I was taking these screenshots, I think I was hungry. I don't know, but this is where we're going to dig into first. And so when we click on one of these, what we have is essentially several subtopics that this breaks out into. Typically, it might be anywhere from 5 to 10. I think this one for food has 6 or 7. I'm showing you 3 of them here. Farm and factory, cooking at home, and markets. And we get a little bit of a description. So here we get a little bit of context of when it says cooking at home. What are the person who put together this topic, what are they actually thinking about here? What are they, where's the focus going to be? And the same thing for any of these subtopics. This is probably a point where, as an educator, I'm going through this part of the process. This is probably not a point where my elementary students are going through this part of the process. But once we get down to this subtopic, this might be a point where I drop a student into a particular subtopic or offer a particular subtopic for students to do some exploration of their own. Once I click through that subtopic, I'm going to get a short list of primary sources. You're going to see them be in a variety of formats. If appropriate, it's going to be from a variety of different time periods. You can see here what we have just in what we see here. I think this was actually somewhere around 7 to 9 different primary sources that were offered under this cooking at home. But we see here that we get a cookbook. We get a couple of images. One of them very specifically is around like a kitchen item. And so in my mind, these are actually meant to be, give us just a sampling of what DPLA has to offer. And for me, it would be an opportunity to then dig deeper through my searches. So I might then go back and search for cookbooks, and I might narrow that down by time period. I might start searching for different kitchen items, be them large or small, ovens, stovetops, maybe small appliances, those types of things to see if DPLA has imagery around what that might look like. And these would be things, for example, that we've utilized with some projects with our students where they have a, and I may have mentioned this particular unit, we've done it in a few different ways through the past, but a long ago and today unit. And one way that we approached that unit with our first grade in the past is we were actually looked at census records from the mid 1900s. We found the census records for the street that our school is on. We found a apartment or a condominium. I'm not sure how it's defined exactly, but I think like a 2-bedroom apartment that is basically across the street from us in an apartment building that the students probably view on a daily basis, walking into school, walking out of school. And then through this particular apartment had pictures on Zillow that went from the last time that it went up for sale. Now, the pictures were of an emptied out apartment building, but that you got to look at, but you still got to view the kitchen, which had not been updated in a while, and the other rooms. And it definitely had this kind of 1950s feel to it. What we then did was do searches through DPLA and other locations for equipment in the kitchen. Like, what would that kitchen actually have looked like in the 1950s? Can we find images of cupboards and appliances and small appliances from 1950s and earlier that might have existed in that kitchen at the time when those census records were taken? And then what we did was, after breaking down the census records and kind of looking at the family and the age of the students, not students, children, excuse me, that lived in that place, which, not coincidentally with us choosing them, we chose a census record that had young children of 6 or 7 years old, a young child 6 or 7 year old living in that apartment. Students then created basically a short story about what they think that child's life, a small moment in that child's life, could have been like. So they had already been writing kind of their own small moments for themselves. And then we kind of drew out, flushed out as much as we could that child's life through primary sources, and then and secondary sources for that matter. And then where the students utilize those to kind of immerse themselves and try to take on the role of that young person and write a story around them. So this is something, as you might think, kind of trivial as like cooking at home. It's one way that we were able to tap into ideas provided through DPLA and then dig deeper through the searching mechanisms that were provided. Let's go ahead and move on to what browsing by partner looks like. And I've got just a screenshot here of partners of DPLA, and you can kind of read down the list along with how many items they provide. Now, what I want to say about partners is that partners are not the same as institutions. So my best understanding, or maybe the best way I can describe partners, is a collection of institutions, typically regionally put together to then provide resources through to DPLA, kind of like a middleman, for lack of a better term. So instead of a state having 6, 8, 10, 12 institutions providing all of their individual metadata to DPLA, you have this partner that instead communicates with the smaller institutions and says, here's how DPLA needs all of your information. We're going to make sure we're communicating that all to you. We're going to collect that, and we're going to be the ones to check it and then provide it to DPLA. So they're kind of a middle person. You can see here that Kentucky Digital Library is a partner, and we'll talk a little bit more about them and how to dig deeper into that in just a moment. But you can see that you've got partners from across the United States. Some of them are easy to identify by regions. Also, you have some single institutions. So you can see Harvard Library, for example, as one of them. Also, I want to point out that you see larger institutions such as Library of Congress, and some of these institutions like Library of Congress or National Archive is another example. They do not necessarily provide all of their digitized resources to DPLA. So none of these partners may provide all of their digital resources. They might provide only some of them. So Library of Congress, we know, if you happen to watch on our earlier, one of my earlier sessions, tens and tens, hundreds of thousands of digitized resources, really. But here, to DPLA, they're only providing about 4,500 or just under that. Let's dig a little bit deeper into that Kentucky Digital Library. If you click through to that and then refine your search by contributing institution, you can see who in Kentucky is actually contributing to DPLA. Who are these institutions? So University of Kentucky, Transylvania University, Lexington Public Library, Murray State, Morehead State University, et cetera, down the line. Kentucky's kind of interesting because you can see here that some of these institutions only provide literally just like single digit numbers of items. I actually I couldn't get all of them in my screenshot. There's actually a couple more that have, 2 and 1 items that they're providing. I thought that was pretty interesting. I don't know if that was kind of like a test run or what exactly might be happening there. But that's who's providing materials. From here, if you wanted to, you could click on any of these institutions and you could see specifically what they're offering. That might not be helpful with somebody with an institution like University of Kentucky that has over 132,000 contributing items, but it might be interesting to do very kind of like a quick scroll of Jefferson Historical Museum, Filson Historical Society, even Murray State. And then you could narrow down even more by format or date range or something like that to kind of target in and see what type of items that these particular institutions are providing to DPLA. And when I say providing, hopefully you understand from what I said earlier that they're not actually sending the digitized items to DPLA. They're just providing that metadata so that DPLA can link you as a searcher to their digitized resources. Now, one thing I want to say too, as Kentucky is also kind of a unique in what I was finding here. Many of the items that I was searching, when I would then try to click, I could see the item on or through DPLA and read all of the metadata that DPLA had. But then when I would try to click through to the contributing institution, it would splash me over to kind of like a main Kentucky page where I could start searching. If I then pulled the name of the item and put it in parentheses and search for it through that Kentucky link, it would bring me there. So right now there might be a little bit of, if we're looking specifically for Kentucky resources, which I know some of you may be, there might be a little bit of a disconnect because there might be kind of rerouting things. And I don't know there may be some people here who know this better than I do about Kentucky, kind of maybe there's some kind of concerted effort to bring all of these materials together under one statewide umbrella. But DPLA is still showing those links, but it brings you back kind of to this overall large splash page. Now, I wanted to pause and just kind of have a moment to, and I'm going to actually stop my sharing for a moment and just mention about reaching out to local institutions, because it's something that I really believe extremely strongly in. And I think it's something that across grade levels, but I think especially at elementary, can be extremely beneficial. And the reason that I can is that I think this is because I've seen time after time with my students how reaching out to local institutions and bringing in primary sources that are regionally close, is one way that students can connect to history, can connect to the sources that they're looking at. I mentioned the Missouri History Museum earlier, and that's one institution. I mentioned it's literally within walking distance of my school, about 8, 9, 10-minute walk. And they have digitized and non-digitized items that are from the neighborhood where my school exists, that are from the neighborhoods where my students walk to school, drive to school, or bus to school from every day. And being able to say, oh, this street is one great way that students can connect. It's not unheard of for, especially through primary source maps, to be able to draw from some of those primary sources from national institutions. I'm thinking about Sanborn maps for those of you who might be familiar with those. Those are incredible maps that were used to basically provide fire insurance for towns and cities. And those can provide some really detailed looks at, in a map form, of what types of buildings were on certain streets and what certain streets, how built up they were at certain periods of time. But you're going to, more than likely, if you have those institutions that are within reach, going to be ones that are have even more items that are going to be even more closely connected with your local history. And even when you're doing work in your curriculum that's national, if that national event has a statewide or even community-wide has been impacted at the state level, or people have been impacted or were impacted at the regional or at the city or town level, having primary sources that are closer geographically is, again, one really great way for students to connect. I'm wondering, and you can just drop it in the chat if you have any examples of any institutions that you think might hold primary sources in your local area, and really even across the state. I mentioned some of them already that showed up through that DPLA search that were already being offered. But are there any other ones that maybe you can think of that might be out there that might house some types of primary sources? Again, libraries are great. Museums, big and small, are great. Historical societies, archives, any of those can be really great resources for locally looking at primary sources, looking for primary sources, excuse me. And so we've got, I mentioned like Missouri History Museum's huge, right? It pulls mostly from the eastern half of the state and Illinois, kind of the St. Louis metropolitan region, but really also houses materials from across the state. But we also have much smaller museums that are kind of like, I call them like mom and pop museums that only that kind of exist for a small municipality and might just exist off of volunteers that work that museum. It might only be open, a day or two a week under certain limited hours. Might only be open upon request, but it might be something that houses historical items. We also have our libraries sometimes house historical items, records that might be interesting for all of these same reasons. So any of these could be ones that you might be interested in tapping into in your state to be able to draw from. Now, these mom and pop museums, these libraries, these smaller groups, even the larger groups that kind of draw statewide, they might, or they likely don't have all of their items, if any of them, digitized. So these are times where, at least for me, I'm doing work to reach out via email, via phone, to the volunteers, to the librarians, to the archivist at these institutions, and trying to see what they have. And usually for me, that means explaining what I'm looking for, the age level of student, maybe. I'm often describing what I'm hoping they might have as far as format. Like, I'm really hoping to have photographs connected to this event. I'm really interested to see if you have maps connected to this event. But then being open to say, if you have anything else, that's wonderful too, because I'm looking for anything and everything under the sun. What my personal experiences are is when I've reached out to them as an educator and I've said, here's what I'm looking for, here's why I'm looking for it, here's what I'm hoping to find, but I'm open to whatever you have. And here's my timeline. And when I do that, I make sure that I'm doing that's giving them ample time to respond to me, number one, but also to potentially look for things, because they might not be experts on the particular event or time period that I'm talking about. Maybe their expertise kind of lies in another area of the collections of whatever their institution is. So I'm trying to give them time to look for things as well. What I found is that these individuals, be they volunteers or librarians or archivists or historians or whatever it is, they're often bending over backwards to help find items that then can be used by students, because the idea of what they're trying to do, even though what they're really trying to do ultimately at its core is to preserve whatever their holdings are, the other thing they're trying to do is also preserve while making it accessible. And so that is the finding that balance and giving them opportunities to making their collection accessible has been something that I found they are very, very willing to do. I know that you have done, I think you've made some trips around to different institutions, or at least one or two institutions in Kentucky. Is that right? Yes, I'm seeing a head nod. So that means that you may already have some connections. You may already have some ideas of what holdings are there, but even if you're not sure and you're hoping it might be there, reaching out to that institution as one opportunity might be a good option for you. And the other thing I'll say for these individuals is when they have knowledge of, well, I don't have this or we don't have this, but this other institution might, they will point you in the direction where they think you will be most successful in finding what you're looking for. My point is simply that making the time for a phone call or an email has proven to me to be invaluable and has gotten me some of the most interesting, some of the most engaging historical items that I've ever been able to put in front of my students. And things sometimes that I was expecting, and then other times things that I wasn't expecting at all. One time with my that historical history museum, we were doing some preliminary work around transportation and the trolley system in St. Louis. That not only were they able to find us pictures and maps, which is two of the things that we really were hoping they could find us. They were finding us brochures. They were finding us the time cards of the people who ran the trolleys so that we could see the schedule and how it ran. They had, I don't know why they had these, but they had hundreds of tickets and punch cards that individuals would use. So they wouldn't get on and pay money for their ride. They would have their ticket punched for their ride. And so all of these pieces together really helped us immerse ourselves and then immerse our students in an understanding of what life was like as far as transportation was concerned for many people in our area when it came to trolley transportation. They were able to go well above and beyond what our expectations were for what they were able to share. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing again. There we go. And I want to talk briefly about primary source sets that are also available on DPLA. So DPLA primary source sets, if memory serves, there's over 130, 140 primary source sets that are available. You can just browse all of those particular sets as far as seeing the titles and topics along with a little bit of imagery for them. But you can also search them by subject, or you can search them by, or browse them, I should say, probably by subject or by time period. And you can see what those time periods are and subjects are there as well. I will say it says American literature. A lot of that American literature is really talking about secondary school, really often about high school. One example where that's not the case is the Watsons Go to Birmingham primary source set, 1963. By Christopher Paul Curtis. You can see there, along with a couple of other sets that happen to be in that same row. I wanted to share those with you. When you see this, you'll also notice that there are tags underneath each one of those primary source sets. So you can see that the Watsons Go to Birmingham has also been tagged under post-war United States, contemporary United States, and American literature and African Americans. So if you want to see what is under any of those tags, for example, if you want to see what are the other primary source sets that have to do with American literature or with African Americans, you can click any of those tags and it will repopulate with those specific collections or sets, I should say, primary source sets. Now, fair warning, I mentioned this earlier, although I didn't kind of review my definition of a primary source. My definition of a primary source being that it is an object or item directly connected to a topic of study, in this case, this particular piece of literature, and a specific time period. So we're talking about 1963. With the Watsons example, not all of the sources in the primary source sets, I would not count them all as actual primary sources. So for example, in this particular primary source set about women and the Civil War, there is an excerpt from this piece of writing, What Women Did for the War and What the War Did for Women, as a speech. And that speech was given in 1894, well after the Civil War. And so more than likely, I would not count that as a primary source, but it is in the primary source set. I can't explain exactly. Essentially, the individual who put that particular set together, they and I disagree on the definition of a primary source. If you want to make sure that your time periods are exactly lined up, just make sure that you look at what they're actually offering you. Not saying don't use this source. In my mind, this could be an incredible secondary source, much closer to the time period than what we would have written today. But this could be maybe more of a reflection of the late 19th century and it's how it viewed the Civil War than actually connected directly to the Civil War. So that's why I say I don't count that particular piece as a primary source, just as one example. Let's go back to Watson's Go to Birmingham. If you click through on that, what you're going to see are the source sets right here. It's usually going to have 8 to 12 different primary sources, a variety of formats. You'll get the title of that particular piece as well. You're going to get some additional resources that are available. So you're going to be able to click out, and this might be something that's within DPLA, like our first one on activism in the US, the online exhibit, but it might be things that are secondary sources or primary sources that are outside of DPLA. So you can see here a segment from Eyes on the Prize from PBS, a segment from CBS News. So you've got lots of things that are going to be kind of extensions of what this primary source set has to offer. And then it's also going to have a teaching guide. Those teaching guides are typically going to have discussion questions. You can see here, very detailed in this particular discussion question that you're able to see in this screenshot. It also is going to have, likely going to have possible activities. Those are very detailed as well. So you're gonna, if you want some jumping off points, if you want something you can just pick up and move with, that teaching guide might be a very helpful piece for you. Now, as we move into what else is sitting on this particular element, or this particular primary source set, we're kind of moving into this idea of interacting with DPLA sources. And again, this is what is already under DPLA's roof, what they have to offer. Anything that we've talked about in any earlier sharing that I've done with you, or that you've learned with anyone else that's sharing with you about primary sources, would also be fair game, right? We can approach these in any particular way. So we can use our close reading with historical documents that we've talked about in an earlier segment. We can use the See, Think, Wonder. We can use, for example, a question formulation technique. There's a variety of things that we can use to tap into for students to interact with these primary sources. But what DPLA has is some suggestions here on a primary source analysis. Now, these are general, right? Because they're talking about the entire primary source set, so they're not specific to a particular format. They're in general things that we might want to approach when it comes to this particular source set. And then below that, you'll notice the links to additional tools. We'll start with the one from the Library of Congress. It's going to drop you to this page up top, and then you're going to want to click to Teachers Guides and Analysis Tools, and from there, the link at the bottom to the Primary Source Analysis Tool. That's something that we've looked at ourselves at a separate time that I've chatted with you all, but that is linked through DPLA as well, along with this is from the National Archives. And the National Archives has document analysis worksheets. And you can see here that these worksheets are under a variety of topics. So under Library of Congress, and let me actually go back a slide if I could. If I would scroll down from the Teacher's Guide and Analysis Tools, we would have questions, and you might remember this from an earlier session. We would have questions that you could ask students about, for example, newspapers or prints and photographs or manuscripts or sheet music. They would be questions, but the primary source analysis tool is universal. That can be used for any of those particular formats. What the National Archive has done is a little bit different, where they have taken all of those different types of formats, and they've done two things. They've said, hey, this is what this could look like for photographs, written documents, artifacts, posters, maps, cartoons, etc. And then they've said, here's the types of things you might want to do with novice or younger students. on the left. And here's the types of things or worksheets you might want to use for intermediate or secondary students on the right. So they've kind of broken it up in that way as well. When you look at that, this is some of the questions that you may see. So this is for a photograph. The first thing it's going to ask you to do is to quickly scan the photo. What do you notice? And then it's going to say, you know, answer this the best you can. Use the caption if you can to help. Who took this photo? Where is it from? So in that case, what they're really trying to do is in some way sourcing the item and then looking at historical evidence. What did you find out from this photo that you might not learn anywhere else? What other documents, photos, or history evidence are you going to use to help you understand this event or topic? So it's giving students some places to go. For me, this is often a little too specific. What I like to do is I do use some of these to draw questions, but I don't often hand students these worksheets. And that's just me personally. That's often because this feels a little more isolated in my mind and maybe a little bit less collaborative to use a worksheet like this. The way that it's structured and set up, that might be more beneficial for secondary students when they're doing this on their own. But when I'm doing my kind of primary source analysis collaboratively where we're discussing it, for example, like what we were doing today, or students are writing things down, but they're doing it in a large group, or I shouldn't say a large group, but a group, this formatting doesn't necessarily lend itself to kind of the vision that I have for what my students are doing. So I do use these, but I more like draw from them as inspiration as opposed to using them directly. But that being said, no fault to anyone who just says, hey, this is perfect for me right now and what my students are able to do, and pick it up and use it also. I will say that in my opinion, even younger students who have done a fair amount of primary source analysis might actually benefit from the types of questions that are offered on the intermediate or secondary student worksheet. So even even sometimes my second graders, but definitely third, fourth, fifth, if they've done a lot of primary source analysis and they feel super comfortable with it, the types of questions that are on those secondary worksheets are more beneficial to my students. They encourage my students to dig a little bit deeper. All right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and stop there. We have just a couple minutes if anybody does have any questions. But if not, I just want to take a moment to not only thank you for joining me for this session today, and I know you'll get the evaluation link dropped down into the chat here, but if you've happened to join me for any of my other sessions, or if you've gone back and watched any of my other sessions, I want to thank you for spending some time with me kind of across this whole semester as well. I've had a good time enjoying, I've had some time enjoying, and even though this was a little less interactive today, just interacting, hearing the kinds of things that you're doing, and the kinds of resources that you're drawing from with your students. My hope is that you have some ideas that you can draw from, and definitely resources with these 5 sessions this semester that you can draw from. And that evaluation has been dropped into the chat for you to fill out at your convenience. I think it's on the little calendar too, I noticed, right? That has like a list.
Yes.
Yeah, so you can grab it at any point if you don't happen to get a chance to do it right now.
Thank you, Tom. Does anybody have any questions or comments? This is our last session for this semester.
With me, not your last session overall.
Right. Thank you for saying that. That's a very good point.
Yeah, don't bail. I saw what was coming, and you've got a lot of great things that are coming over the next weeks.
We do.
Oh, Mindy's already done a little searching and found some items on DPLA. Mindy, that is awesome. I love that. And thank you, Donna, for joining me today. I appreciate that.
And I have put all of everything that you've shared has been put in their Wakelet. So if you must have missed something, forgot something, haven't got to watch the recording, just look at your Wakelet and you'll see all of the links and resources that Tom has shared.